One of the best marketing or PR at the time that we received was there was a huge fire in the Mumbai docks, and almost everything in that fire was found to be destroyed, except for items that had been stored in Godrej safes.
Pirojsha Godrej, the man who built Godrej Properties into a global leader in sustainable construction. He doesn't just develop buildings, he shapes how cities evolve. And he backs businesses and individuals who build real-world products.
One of our earliest products was actually locks and safes.
How did that idea come to you?
Political independence wouldn't be fully meaningful unless we had economic independence.
So scale often becomes the enemy of quality. How do you solve for that tension between quality and speed?
Being delayed is not usually a sign of being better quality. I think most delayed projects end up with worse quality than an on time.
Hardware is hard, but
essential.
Thank you, Pirojsha, for doing this. Yeah.
Great to be with you, Pranesh.
So in a world obsessed with speed, software, and instant gratification, how have you built your entire career making things that take a long time, like factories, buildings, institutions? What keeps you still excited about such a sector?
Yeah, I think, there's a certain thrill and joy and sense of meaning that comes from building physical products. As you pointed out, a big part of my career, particularly at the start of my career, was spent in the real estate sector, which is one of the longest duration, cycles for any product. You typically, from the time you buy a land, at a minimum, it's about 5 years till you complete a project. Often it can be 10 years or more. But I think when you see that product come up, in my case, for example, we're sitting today in an office building that I helped conceive and build. I live now in a home that is a Godrej Properties home that again I helped conceive and build. So there is a certain, I think, deep meaning and satisfaction that comes out from that. And I think, real estate sector does have its share of headaches and problems. But the thing I probably love the most about it is the product is something you can touch, feel, experience. There is a thrill to people coming in and out of your buildings. And I think so that the durability, the sort of more permanent nature of it, I think is something that excites me.
Yeah, well, very well said. I think the permanence nature and the very fact that you can actually touch and feel what you have made can make it really, really thrilling. So a lot of people think that hardware's renaissance time is here in India, right? And there is a lot of Kool-Aid flowing all the time as well, right? So what, from your vantage point, do you think the time has come for India's manufacturing sector? And when I say hardware, I mean more electrical, electronics products and appliances.
Yeah, I think it has come. I think there is several factors behind that now. I think if you look at some of India's key national priorities, I think one would be job creation. I think manufacturing has been a template that has worked in many different countries as at this stage of economic growth to provide the kind of job creation needed. And I think India is now making a concerted effort around that. I think equally, if you look at it, it's almost become a mandate now, given what's happening geopolitically. Now, I'm not a great fan of the direction the world is taking on this in terms of trying to re-erect barriers that have been successfully broken down. But I think with what is happening, we have to be realistic, we have to respond. And I think some level of self-sufficiency is going to be important. And I think that's another important lens with which to view this question. So I think the time has come, the policy agenda is here, the infrastructure, the investments are all happening. But I think at the same time, it's important to keep in mind that a renaissance is not a flick of a switch or a quick moment in time. It's something that comes through deep work, through gaining expertise, through gaining experience, building on kind of each other's expertise and experience over time. So I think a lot of hard work will be required. It will sometimes feel, I'm sure, like one step forward, two steps back. But I think certainly it seems like an idea whose time has come, and there's no real choice but to make sure as a country, I think, that we get really good and keep our commitments to kind of building manufacturing at a very high level.
Oh, okay. So that brings two questions to my head. So I'll go one by one, right? So the first one, you mentioned about India's time and then how government policies and Make in India and everything is coming together at the right time, right? But do you think at times India underestimates the creativity, intelligence, dignity that is there in manufacturing, which is reflected sometimes in the stock prices of some of the manufacturing companies? And even when I think of my college days, most engineers, when they graduated, they still wanted to go into consulting, finance, or software. Nobody was looking to get into core manufacturing jobs. So do you think Indian society does not give it as much dignity as manufacturing has, let's say, in China or a US or a Germany?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think that there might be something there. Hopefully, that is also part of this journey of change. Will come through, I think, India demonstrating huge successes in manufacturing. I think, you rightfully pointed out China is probably the best example in our time.
Yeah.
But if you'd gone back 20, 30 years, you could probably have said something quite similar about China. And they've made dramatic progress in a relatively short period of time after their economic reforms and things. And I think it does become something where, as you gain expertise, as you build an ecosystem, this sort of takes off hand in hand. So I think if you look at, say, something like Shenzhen, it is now a hugely powerful manufacturing hub for China and the world.
Yeah.
But it's because, so many incremental investments, incremental improvements were made.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we need. We're at an earlier stage of development, but I'm quite confident that we will make the investments necessary. And as we look back, hopefully 20 years from now, we will say that India too has become a manufacturing powerhouse. But yes, I think today society is perhaps not placing as much value on it as it should.
Yeah.
But I think the decision making from the top, whether at the government level or at senior business level, I think is there, and in terms of supporting this. So hopefully we can make the changes necessary so that society as a whole kind of sees this as vital as it is.
Perfect. So that was my second question, right? Like, while the society probably has not started giving the dignity, you have backed founders, and I'm not fishing for compliments here, but hardware feedback loops are brutal, right? It takes a lot of time to understand what prototype has worked, what has not, and there are many reasons why there is non-linear growth. In such a scenario where you have backed a startup, and where, especially in the hardware sector, where there is near-death moments happening, what signals do you look for in a founder to keep backing them?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, these near-death signals are probably hardware or not, part and parcel of entrepreneurship and building businesses.
Yeah.
You might be right that I think some of them become even more extreme as you look at the elongated cycles in hardware. I think a couple of things that come to my mind as important characteristics for any entrepreneur. One would be, what is their character? Okay. And how intellectually honest can they be with themselves? There are going to be undoubtedly moments of great stress, great challenge. Do they acknowledge those for what they are, face them head on, or do they, kind of obfuscate and find sort of excuses instead of really understanding and trying to get into the depth of the problem? I almost look at it, there's a capability angle to it, but I think the more important is the character and intellectual honesty part of that.
Yeah.
And I think second, I'd say adaptability, because, in any business, particularly at the startup stage, there are going to be curveballs, there are going to be things that happen that are quite unexpected.
Yeah.
You are going to have to be very adaptable. So I think, that ability for someone to pivot, to first acknowledge what the issue is, understand how to tackle it. We've seen a couple of examples where I think you've had to pivot in different directions. And I think that gives a lot of confidence that the promoter and founder is fully aware of what's going on, is being honest about the level of challenge in a situation, and is willing to think creatively and act decisively to address the challenge.
Okay. So intellectual honesty, you will put that above the intellectual capability part.
Yes. I mean, again, I think, at a certain level, some things are table stakes. So, if you're not intellectually capable, probably, hopefully, most people are not even thinking of starting companies.
Yeah.
But I think I'm almost taking that as a given.
Yeah.
But, I would certainly rather, if you could get a 10 percentile extra in one or the other, I would take the intellectual honesty and character part over the capability.
Great. After I was reading one of your interviews on the internet, and you had said that after the realignment within the Godrej Group, there is a lot of clarity that you have now in terms of building for decades. Now, when the vantage point that I look at, right, or my friends, startup founders, when you are thinking about next month's payroll all the time, right? How do you then get into that mindset, that clarity that you have about building for decades? What is your cheat code that a startup founder can then start thinking in those terms?
Yeah. Well, look, you have to keep all time frames in mind simultaneously. So I think it's, nice to talk about thinking in decades, and you have to do some amount of thinking in decades.
Yeah.
We probably won't reach those decades unless, you make sure certain things happen this year. So I think it's important to get that balance right. But I think strategic clarity is very critical. Whether you're running a large conglomerate, whether you're running a startup, what exactly is it that you're trying to do? And also, what is it that you won't do? Because I think there are many opportunities, particularly, say in a role like mine, where we are a conglomerate with an established brand. Yeah. We're operating in a country where every sector is doing well and growing. There are many opportunities worth pursuing. So how do you select within those where to put your resources, where to put your bandwidth? And actually, if I look back at the history of the Godrej Group, I'd say there are many things we've done outstandingly well. So I think, the kind of reputation and brand we've built, the way we've conducted ourselves over this period, I think has built, a huge amount of confidence both in our customers' minds, our teams' minds, and that is really a priceless asset we hold. But if I was being a little bit more self-critical, I'd say we've also perhaps been guilty of spreading ourselves a little bit too thin at times, perhaps entering too many new businesses without first ensuring we, took the existing businesses to truly full potential. Okay. I think a lot of what I'd like to do over the next few years is make sure, again, that we're really thinking quite deeply about what full potential for each business looks like. Okay. And rather than opening up too many new fronts, first really focus on achieving that full potential or as close to it as we can in the existing businesses.
Perfect, because India gives you a scale in any sector that you are in. So why not maximize that and then get into the other sectors? Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Okay, so my next segment is about manufacturing at scale or building at scale. So scale often becomes the enemy of quality, especially in, let's say, when you are doing real estate. Mm. How do you solve for that tension between quality and speed?
Yeah. So, a couple of things on this, Pranesh. One, first you have to measure for quality, right? Yeah. Because I think if you don't have clarity on what is good quality, first of all, what are the inputs that will determine good quality. So you have to, I think, measure both the inputs and the outputs and be clear that you are going to hold the concerned teams and individuals responsible for delivering quality. I think without that formal call out and measurement and consistency, it can sometimes fall by the wayside, and speed can sometimes take priority. That said, I would also say if I look at most of the projects we've done historically and say, is there a very clear evidence of this trade-off in practice? My honest answer would be no. Most projects tend to either do well, and by that I mean do well on both speed and quality, or often when things aren't working well, both tend to suffer. Okay. And the reason is that I think both are kind of symptoms of a process and set of capabilities working well together, or of something not working and something kind of going awry. So when we say speed and quality are in tension, it's absolutely true, and there obviously are instances of trade-offs where it's important to keep this in mind. But it's also important to keep in mind that being delayed is not usually a sign of being better quality. There's, I think most delayed projects end up with worse quality than an on-time project. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. I push my teams a lot when they, try to say that something is delayed because we were striving for better quality. Yeah. There are instances where that's a valid claim, but I think more often than not, as I said, I think these things tend to move together.
Yeah, that's a good delineation, right? It's not that people who are achieving for greatness are the only ones getting delayed. So on that, I remember, I think very early in our interactions in 2020 or 21, you once told me that NPS is a key metric in leadership compensation at Godrej, which is something which I find very unique, right? Like at a startup, I don't think we have still gotten to a point where we start measuring NPS in the right manner and to bring it to compensation. How did that idea come to you? And what is the stage at which a startup should start thinking about it?
I think it should start thinking about it off the bat. So I think, we recently started a new company in financial services. As we were designing the incentive system, this was put there from day one. Wow. And for anyone who doesn't know, NPS is Net Promoter Score, which is essentially a measurement of customer satisfaction, directly taken from customer ratings of a company's performance. I think Pranesh, the idea for this came in different ways, but I think it is very much part of who we are at the Godrej Group. As we look back at our history and the background of the group, the group was actually founded in 1897, so 50 years before independence. Yeah. And it was my great-grandfather's older brother who started the business, and his rationale for starting the business, he'd actually trained as a lawyer. Yeah. But his rationale for starting the business was in the time of the freedom movement. And he strongly believed that political independence wouldn't be fully meaningful unless we had economic independence, which in turn would depend on capability building. Yeah. Yeah. And one of his huge focus areas was quality of the products he was building. Yeah. One of our earliest products was actually locks and safes. Yeah. And one of the best marketing or PR at the time that we received was there was a huge fire in the Mumbai docks, and almost everything in that fire was found to be destroyed, except for items that had been stored in Godrej safes. Wow. So this got a huge amount of PR at the time and earned the group one of its first great advantages in its reputation for quality. And I think that has been something that through many generations, through lots of hard work of many Godrejites through the years, has been built. So I think first and foremost, it's something that is deeply part of who the Godrej Group is. And I think one of my first priorities is to make sure that we add to that and not in any way detract from that. So I'd say quality should be in some ways a goal in and of itself. And I think it can be quite motivating, quite exciting for teams to be focused on it. And I think no one in the end wants to. I think there might have to be shortcuts, there might be other things, but when people are building something, they want to believe in the product they're building. So I think quality in some ways should be a goal in and of itself. But of course, it's not that someone's asking you to build quality at the expense of anything else. There might be, again, short-term trade-offs that you have to make, but in the long term, having a reputation for quality is so powerful and so valuable that it's almost foolish not to, especially if you've inherited, as we have at the Godrej Group, this reputation, and you can see before you how much it helps us. Whether in terms of discussions with customers, discussions with bankers, partners, anyone, this reputation of trustworthiness, which is quality of one type in terms of governance, and quality of actual product, helps so very much that we'd be almost foolish from a purely financial perspective even not to want to reinvest in that. So I think starting with that as the groundwork, we then have to think about what will help us measure quality consistently. And one of the best ways we think is a net promoter score system, especially in a long feedback business like real estate. I think you need multiple ways of measuring quality. So we actually found that just net promoter score wasn't good enough actually, and we need much more technical, construction-linked, observable measurements as well. So we've now tried to combine both of those. But I think the most, frank feedback is always from your customers. As I think Jeff Bezos and others have said, customers are delightfully unsatisfied at all times, always expecting you to do better. And I think if you have a learning mindset and can inculcate that in the organization where, it's not looked at as something to be dreaded or avoided, but as an opportunity to learn and get better, I think that can be very powerful for the business.
Two great thoughts are coming to my mind from listening to you, right? The one line that you mentioned, right? Quality should be a goal in itself. I think that's a very important, very powerful line that one should remember and imbibe. And second is, while growing up, like Godrej locks and wardrobes and everything that you were saying, right? They were sort of the proper noun of Godrej was being used as a common noun there, right? At least in the cities that I was growing up. So great to hear that you took that and converted into an NPS, and now it's such a powerful metric at Godrej Properties. Okay, the next question, again, this is from a startup lens, right? Building in abundance versus building in scarcity. So there are always opposing thoughts. There are some people who say that in scarcity is where innovation happens, right? But in your case, I don't know whether there was abundance or scarcity when you started running this group. But what's your take? Where does innovation actually happen better?
That's a great question. I think there's no correct answer to that. I think it's much more about the quality of thinking that happens in an organization. Sometimes that can be, I think clearly startups have shown over the last many years the kind of power of real hunger and real scarcity and freshness of thinking. And there's no question, I think that brings a certain edge and a certain hunger that is hard to replicate in more established organizations. At the same time, I think you have both in globally and here in India, large companies that are doing a lot of good work in coming up with big new businesses, big new ideas.
Yeah.
So there are advantages that I think lie on each side of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Having the ability to invest, having the ability to not require any results or any revenue for a few years, does create also powerful abilities to create something with a truly long-term mindset. Yeah. And as we spoke about, the kind of hunger and desire and need to move very quickly, almost out of necessity, can also create that. So I think it comes down to how well the companies are managed, both at the startup end and at the more established end. So I wouldn't say there's a necessarily right answer to that question.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting food for thought.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Let's go to the next section, which is all about your leadership style, and clarity in thoughts and decisions that you bring. So I've been on the receiving end of a lot of negotiations with you, and usually I've come up short. How are you so uncomplicated in your decision making and thoughts? Is there a structure or a mental framework that you follow which allows you to be this clear?
No, I think, Pranesh, the more you do something, I think the more you're familiar with the types of decisions, the more you've encountered similar things, and you're approaching a conversation with a certain perspective. Yeah. I think it helps in quick decision making. I'd also say, I think my bias is to say that you should take decisions quickly, because in most instances, spending a lot of time is not actually adding much information. Yeah. There are, of course, important exceptions to that, and I think it's quite dangerous in certain situations to be overly hasty with decision making. Yeah. But I think in most situations in business, quick decisions are helpful, particularly as most business decisions are reversible. Yeah. So if something you feel is not working out exactly as you thought it would, you can always pivot and adjust your decision. But my sense is that whether in terms of managing people effectively, I think we've all probably experienced at one point in life or another, whether in business or in our personal lives, some decision you're waiting for from someone else, just draining you of your energy to kind of create impact. Yeah. So I think one of my big concerns when you're running a group with several companies, a lot of decisions flowing up, is that you should not be a bottleneck. Mm-hmm. So I think that helps me be clear that unless there is a very extreme situation where I really feel we need to be more careful, or I feel I don't have the information, I need to take the decision, it's better to take that decision. And I think you get more and more comfortable with taking decisions as you get practice with them, particularly if you've seen similar scenarios, you've learned from previous decisions, whether they've worked, not worked. That helps you come to a judgment. And the other thing is, it's important to rely on your teams, because I think, you often will have people who are closer on the ground to a situation than you are, will have their own views on a particular decision. And if they feel strongly about it, I think it's quite important to back them, unless, again, there's some reason to think that you have a perspective that is very different, or that they aren't keeping in mind certain important aspects.
Yeah. No, I should have qualified my question. When I meant that you are quick at decision making, I also know that you are very detailed in those, right? There have been times, just to qualify my question, right, where I have thought that I have given it a lot of thought, and I have suggested a very complicated structure, and you have responded very quickly. So yeah, I did not mean that your decision making is just quick. I meant that it's very detailed as well. It's just, I think you have a very good structure around you, and I don't want to praise you too much when you are a guest on my podcast. But I've seen that whenever you have said that you will, let's say, connect me to somebody or introduce me to somebody, by the time I've left this room and gotten into my cab, you have already done that. How are you able to manage? Is there a structure that you have made in your life, personal life, which allows you to be this quick at following through and closing loops?
No, I think it comes from this desire to not become a bottleneck. So if there's something you can help with, I think you're building a business, you've got your hands full. I think you're on an exciting journey. We are a partner, an investor. I see it as my role to do what I can to help make you successful, and certainly to make sure I'm not being a bottleneck for your decision making. You have enough challenges out there to succeed in the marketplace without your partners and investors becoming one of them. So just I think my goal again with any team I'm working with is to try and make sure that I'm facilitating, empowering, motivating to the extent I can.
Yeah.
And I find that is something that people appreciate and want to reciprocate.
Yeah.
So it's win-win for everyone.
Yeah, perfect. As you prepare to take on the chairperson role of the group, how are you thinking about the next chapter, culturally, strategically, philosophically?
I think it's a really exciting time to be working in India.
Yeah.
I think if you look at it as a country, we're likely to be the fastest growing major country in the world for the next couple of decades.
Yeah.
So I always tell, whether teams at Godrej Properties or other parts of the group, we're actually quite blessed to be professionals at this time in this place.
Yeah.
I think I feel even extra blessed to be have the opportunity to lead a group like Godrej, which has such a strong brand, has such a strong reputation. And I think the goal for us is to make sure we build on that in multiple ways. I think one, from a culture and values perspective, I think we've really inherited something very special.
Yeah.
And it's very important to guard that, protect that, make sure we're giving back to that and strengthening that over a period of time.
Yeah.
And from a business results perspective, I actually think we need to set our ambitions a little bit higher, as we were speaking about earlier.
Yeah.
I think we've done a lot of great things in the group, built some great companies. But I think given the kind of brand we have, given the strength of the teams, given the kind of opportunity India is throwing up at the moment, I think we really need to be very optimistic, be very ambitious. Of course, make sure we're not losing focus on financial conservatism and making sure we have a strong balance sheet and good risk protection measures. But I think we do need to aim quite high. And I think one of the goals certainly for us going forward will be to make sure that any business that we're in seeks to be a leader in the spaces it operates in.
Perfect. So, okay, last question in this section. You come from a family that has been in news or in the public eye for generations, yet you seem to have chosen a slightly quieter conviction building life. Is that a conscious choice?
Oh, I think, Pranesh, everyone's different. So I think when I look at it, I think you have some CEOs and founders who are very extroverted, take a lot of energy from being in public meetings, being in the media, interacting with people tremendously, and do it both to get that energy as well as to build strong connections, build opportunities. So I think, if that is how you get energy, that's a great way to do it and something that can be quite valuable for the business.
Yeah.
I think personally, I'm a little bit more introverted, don't get as much energy from, public interactions, or at least at a very constant pace. So I think I prefer to spend a little bit more time introspecting, thinking, working with teams internally. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. I think both can be very effective. Yeah. What's important is kind of understanding yourself, understanding your own strengths and weaknesses, making sure that you're able to effectively utilize your strengths to create value for the organization, understanding how to compensate for your weaknesses or work on them over time so that they can be more of a neutral. So I think this self-awareness piece is quite important and sometimes overlooked. But I think a common trait I would say for most successful leaders is that they do have to have a certain amount of self-awareness.
Yeah. So no Instagram pages, Instagram lives coming soon?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, let's go to the last section of today's discussion, which is more like a rapid fire of fun questions. Okay, mountains, beach, or city walk?
For a holiday, I think, I like being in sort of very out of the way places. So, a couple of my favorite holidays, for example, have been like the Atacama Desert and the Arctic, both of which I did last year. Wow. But yeah, so no specific beach or mountain, but away from people most of the time.
Okay. Black coffee, a podcast, or a silent morning?
Black coffee and a silent morning.
Okay, I was going to ask the next question, which was recommend a book or a podcast.
Yeah, so many. I think one of the ones I recently picked up that I really enjoyed was William Dalrymple's The Golden Road, which talks about kind of India's historic contributions to the world. And coincidentally, I just started reading his son's book called Shattered Lands, which also seems quite interesting, but just started it.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Indian consumer brands have come up a lot in the last couple of decades, but it still feels like that we have something which is still missing compared to, let's say, an European or a American consumer luxury brand. What do you think there is one or two key ingredients that we are missing?
I think sometimes, there's a little bit of overdoing things in the luxury space, and sometimes luxury can be about great simplicity. So, perhaps that is how do we, as Steve Jobs was always focused on in Apple, how do you take things away and make things as simple and to their essence as possible? Okay.
What is one belief that you had very strongly, but you have changed in the last few years as a leader?
I think I for a while felt that, as we talked about this importance of focusing on our existing set of businesses to the exclusion for a while of doing new things. Yeah. I think I'm now getting comfortable with saying, it's time for us to start also experimenting with more new businesses while we do that.
Okay. Architect, filmmaker, cricketer, any alternate career choices that you ever had?
Well, unfortunately, no skills for any of these, but if I had the skill, I think cricketer for sure.
Oh, okay. Great. Complete the line, hardware is hard, but...
essential.
Perfect. Thank you, Pirojsha. Hardware is hard, but making it gets me to talk to people like you, which is what it makes it worthwhile. Thank you, Pirojsha, for doing this.
Thanks very much, Pranesh, and all the very best.
Thank you.